In the war with Russia, Ukraine is supported by almost all of Europe, especially the countries that suffered from Soviet occupation – Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. However, there is another country that was also the object of a direct Soviet invasion in 1956, and today supports those who are trying to resurrect that occupier. This is Hungary. Today, Hungary is pursuing a policy against Ukraine that would be more suitable for some Russian satellite or puppet, for example Lukashenko. But unlike Belarus, we are talking about a country that is a member of the European Union and NATO. It is a rather successful country that sabotages sanctions against Russia. Hungary succeeded in having personal sanctions lifted against a number of Russian officials, including the ministers of culture, sports and Patriarch Kirill, who blessed the Russian military to kill Ukrainians. Hungary was allowed to receive Russian oil despite the embargo, and Viktor Orbán demanded that Ukraine stop receiving military aid. And he, according to a number of sources in the Ukrainian government, questioned the massacre in Bucha, saying that there was no evidence for it. Every day Viktor Orbán is becoming more and more like Alexander Lukashenko. And this is really surprising, because the country has gone through an extremely difficult path to its freedom and sovereignty. It raised the first anti-Soviet uprising and was one of the most progressive developed economies in Central and Eastern Europe. And today, it's foaming at the mouth to defend Russian interests. How did this happen, and why does Hungary behave this way? What are the reasons why the country is increasingly moving away from the developed free world and closer to occupiers and dictators? I will cover all this in this video today. Let's start with historical traumas. In the English version of Wikipedia, there is an article called Trianon Trauma Syndrome that talks about a special social phenomenon that is unique to Hungarian society. Its essence is to prove to other nations that the 1920 treaty was cruel, because many Hungarians found themselves separate in different European countries. In 1914, Hungary was on the wrong side of history by the will of fate. At that time, it was part of the dual kingdom of Austria-Hungary, which launched a war against Serbia in response to the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, Franz Ferdinand. These events later escalated into the First World War, which spread throughout Europe and beyond. The First World War was a war of attrition, where the actions of all parties were questionable. And Hungary was certainly not one of the aggressors, but the consequences of the war were catastrophic for it. According to Hungarian estimates, more than 500,000 Hungarian soldiers were killed in the fighting. This is a lot for a small nation. The coalition of Central Powers to which Hungary belonged suffered a total military defeat, which forced it to sign the humiliating Treaty of Trianon, under which it lost two-thirds of its territories. It should be emphasized here that not all of these lands were ethnically and historically Hungarian. Some of them had been occupied by Austria-Hungary. Nevertheless, some Hungarians found themselves cut off from their homeland. The trauma of Trianon and the desire to revise it became decisive in Hungary's policy in the future. And for this, the Hungarians were ready to ally themselves with absolute evil. This is not exaggeration. In 1939, they chose the side of evil and became members of Hitler's coalition. This time, they did so consciously and independently, and it is no longer possible to hide their decision behind Austria. Moreover, despite the fact that World War II officially began on September 1, 1939, its Hungarian front began in March in the same year, when Hungarian troops occupied the newly created Carpathian Ukraine. And when they enlisted the support of Germans, they tried to take away other pre-Trianon lands. They occupied Romanian Transylvania, part of Serbia and Czechoslovakia. Hungarian troops took an active part in Nazi war crimes. Finally, it's enough to recall the Kharkiv tragedy, which few people know about. This was an unprecedented punitive operation by the Hungarian military on the territory of Ukraine, when they killed almost 7,000 civilians in the Ukrainian village of Kharkivka, Chernihiv region, on March 1st to 2nd, 1943. However, for Hungary it ended the same way as after World War I, with losses and shame. Hungary lost all the newly occupied territories. It suffered a complete military defeat. It suffered huge military losses comparable to those of the First World War. But we must admit that the level of Hungary's shame was not sufficient. The idea of holding a broader version of the Nuremberg Tribunal for the collaborators of Nazi Germany was never realized. The leader of pro-Hitler Hungary, Miklos Horthy, appeared at Nuremberg only as a witness, was not charged and was eventually released. The Soviet Union, which occupied Hungary after the war, was also not interested in promoting the historical memory of Hungarian crimes, as Hungary was already a socialist country. As a result, there is no narrative of repentance in the wider society for the crimes they committed in Hungary. So most of Hungarian society continues to live in the paradigm that Hungary is a victim. The Orban government has built a very powerful political line on this narrative. So powerful that it seems to have begun to believe it itself. Today, Hungary is once again choosing the side of evil, and again, as in 1939, it is doing so consciously. In 2018, Hungarian parliamentary elections ended with the victory of Viktor Orbán's bloc. The prime minister successfully took advantage of the consequences of the EU migration crisis, pumped up Hungarian society with migrant phobia, and in this way received exactly 2/3 of the votes in parliament, 133 out of 199 seats. It is worth emphasizing that this was the third convocation in a row when Orban entered parliament with a constitutional majority. In 2022, the situation seemed to change. The opposition united against the long-time prime minister. Hungarian analysts agreed that he would almost certainly win, but lose his constitutional majority. It was even possible that he would enter parliament with a margin of only a few seats. But the vote count brought a real sensation. Orban not only won, but also increased his score. This means that his new election strategy has proven effective and will surely continue to develop. But there is a big problem. For the first time, it includes openly anti-Ukrainian narratives. Hungarian politics is different from Ukrainian politics in many ways, but the main difference is that the Hungarian government is unchanged. Viktor Orbán first became prime minister back in 1998. After his last victory, Orbán began his fifth term in office. And since 2010, he has been prime minister continuously. Unlike presidents, prime ministers usually have no limit on the number of terms they can serve. However, despite the leader's continuity, the government's ideology has changed significantly from time to time. In 1998, Orban came to power as a liberal. Then he decided that it was more profitable to be a conservative. And in the next election, he and the entire party ran under exactly the opposite political ideology. In 2010, he became prime minister as a pro-European conservative, aligned with the APE group. In 2014, the theme of uniting all Hungarians who found themselves abroad after Hungary's defeat in World War I became his trick. Budapest started handing out passports to Hungarians abroad, created problems with neighboring countries and so on. However, this topic was electorally very favorable because it was very painful for Hungarians. Before the 2018 elections, the narrative changed again. Orban declared war on migrants and Soros, whom he accused of all Hungary's troubles, of forming secret plans, etc. Before the 2022 elections, the Hungarian prime minister decided to change the subject again. The migration threat is over. The legend of Soros who want to destroy the Hungarian identity remained in Hungarian state propaganda, but it no longer seemed convincing enough. The full-scale war in Ukraine created another election topic that eventually came to the fore, and its presence in campaign slowly increased and peaked in the last week before the election. After the election results showed a landslide victory for the government, Viktor Orbán came out to his supporters in Budapest to address them with a speech in which he identified his public enemies. Unfortunately, this list includes Ukraine.
Ez a győzelem azért is marad majd emlékezetes talán életünk végéig, mert most kellett a legnagyobb túlerővel megküzdeni. A baloldal itthon, a nemzetközi baloldal körös körül, a brüsszeli bürokraták, a soros birodalom minden pénze és szervezete, a nemzetközi fősodratú média, és a végén még az ukrán elnök is.
The list of the Hungarian prime minister's opponents had previously been missing in the last element. In the first months of the war, Orban was the only leader in the EU who categorically and fundamentally refused to supply Ukraine with any weapons to defend itself against a Russian attack. Moreover, he announced that he would prohibit even the transit of weapons from other countries through Hungarian territory if they were headed to Ukraine. And this decision became the basis of Fidesz election campaign in the last weeks before the election. Orban and his associates announced that this is main thing that saves Hungary from war. They say that if at least one truck with ammunition passes through Hungary, it will bring the war to Hungarian soil. An absurd and obviously untrue explanation, but it seemed to have been effective for Hungarian voters. The clue to this effectiveness lies in the way the media works in Hungary. For more than 10 years, Orban has nullified freedom of speech and taken control of the country's key media outlets. As a result, many Hungarians, especially those who trust the Prime Minister, live in distorted information reality. This is what allows the Orban government to promote even ridiculous myths. But in the last week before the election, Orban reached a new level. Ukrainian President Zelensky has agreed with the opposition that if it wins, Hungarian soldiers will fight in Ukraine. This resonant and equally ridiculous statement came first from the well-known Viktor Szijjártó, but very quickly became the main theme of the Hungarian state propaganda machine. The message to Hungarian voters was clear. If you elect Orban, there will be peace. If you choose the opposition, there will be war. And the second signal. Ukraine is interfering in the elections and wants to drag Hungary into war. It's difficult to assess whether this fake was a decisive factor in the government's strong election results and the collapse of support for the united opposition, but it's a very real possibility. Thus, Orban has realized that anti-Ukrainian rhetoric does not harm his rating and is likely to work in his favor. Orban's recent meeting with Putin in Beijing is a demonstrative continuation of this policy. The Hungarian Prime Minister became the first Western leader to meet with Putin after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president. Can we say that there was a practical need for such a meeting? Hardly. After all, Orban regularly sends his closest ally, Hungarian Foreign Minister Viktor Szijjártó, to Moscow, who solves all practical issues without much fanfare. So why this demonstration? Orban needs a meeting with Putin to prove that there is an alternative way to stay in NATO and the EU, receive money, enjoy security and build good relations with Beijing, Moscow and even Tehran. Hungary of course condemns the Hamas attack on Israel, but at the same time Foreign Minister Szijjártó spoke with his Iranian counterpart about the situation in the Middle East. But after a recent ministerial meeting and the UN General Assembly, it was decided that Iranian nuclear experts would visit Hungary to study the work of the Hungarian nuclear industry. After that, the words of support for Israel no longer look so unquestionable, do they? Because there is a fact. Hungary remains Iran's only real Western partner, as well as Russia. This is Viktor Orban's model. And to demonstrate this model, he meets with Vladimir Putin. This model is tempting and destructive. It's tempting for those who would like to solve issues rather than defend values. And the recent elections in Slovakia have shown that this model has many supporters. And they are destructive for the democratic world, for Europe. That is why, without creating a mechanism for a clear institutional response to the actions of politicians like Orban, the civilized world risks losing in the confrontation with the despots of the modern world. For too long, the EU and NATO have turned a blind eye to Hungary's transformation into a liberal democracy, where the government can be criticized but not change. To problems with judiciary and media, to corruption and monopolization of power. And before they knew it, they saw that this path necessarily ends in a hug with Putin, to whom Orban owes his political success and a very long period of economic stability and low energy prices for the population. The financing model that Orban has built in Hungary involves on one hand receiving clean money from the European Union and on the other hand supporting his regime with Russian dirty money. And that is why he plays such a strange role. On the one hand, he realized that without the EU his country will have a hard time. And on the other hand, he continues to flirt with Putin. He allows Russian business to enter Hungary, does not offend Russian spy diplomats, and protects Russian Patriarch Kirill from sanctions. However, the main source of funds for Orban remains the European Union, as Russia is cutting funding for the Hungarian economy because of the war with Ukraine. The essence of Orban's anti-Ukrainian rhetoric is not personal revenge against Ukraine, it's a business. Orban's power is supported by Russia's dirty money, gas and oil. Hungary is 85% dependent on Russia for gas, 65% for oil, and 100% for nuclear fuel. Viktor Orban, with his alternative view of Europe and the war in Ukraine, has completely lost his strategic vision and is leading his own country to political and economic defeat. After all, Anti-Hungarian sentiment in the world is growing, and their economy is deteriorating. However, Viktor Orbán has repeatedly proved throughout his political career that there are no fundamental issues or enemies for him. Everything can change if compensators are found. The European Union has levers of influence, including financial ones, then can persuade the Hungarian leader to give in on many issues. Therefore, the situation is not catastrophic, but it will take the will and serious efforts on the part of the EU to prevent it. But there is no doubt that the triangle of Ukraine, the EU and Hungary will face a difficult period ahead.